There is something about a millstone that people keep getting wrong. They look at it and see a relic, something old and finished 48 inches across, maybe 4 inches thick, carved granite weighing somewhere north of 500 pounds, and they think that thing has served its purpose, and that's the end of it. That's a museum piece. That's a conversation starter for people who visit old farmsteads on weekends. What they're missing is the physics. Granite holds heat at a rate of 790 joules per kilogram per degree of temperature rise. That sounds like a unit you'd sleep through in a class, but put it in plain terms. A single millstone, heated slowly over the course of a day, holds enough thermal energy to warm a room for hours after the fire underneath it goes cold. Not in the way a wood stove warms a room all blast, and then nothing but in the way the earth itself holds warmth, steady and patient, and indifferent to what the wind is doing outside. In the winter of 1894 going into 1895, a 71-year-old woman named Vera Lund and her 14-year-old grandson already knew this. They hadn't read it anywhere. No engineering manual told them. What they knew from watching a mill run for 30 years. And when the county of Buchanan, Iowa decided that the abandoned Creekside Mill on the Wapsipinicon River tributary was worthless when the county put it up for back taxes at $7 and nobody else bid, Vera Lund sent her grandson to that auction with $7 silver and a piece of paper. What happened after that is the part I want to tell you. The winter of 1894 came to northeastern Iowa in the way bad winters announce themselves, not with drama, but with absence. The crows left Buchanan County in the second week of October, 3 weeks before they usually did. The muskrats along the Wapsipinicon built their lodges higher and thicker than any of the old German families in Independence had seen in a decade. Vera noticed both of these things. She had been watching that river since 1848, the year she came west with her parents from Telemark, Norway, and she kept a mental ledger of what animals did before a hard winter, the way other people kept financial accounts. She was 71 years old in October 1894, which in Buchanan County at that time made you either an institution or a curiosity, depending on who was talking. Her husband, Peter Lund, had died of pneumonia in February 1891, leaving her the family farm 3 miles east of Quasqueton. Her son, Eric, ran the farm now. Eric had opinions about where his mother should and should not spend her time, and those opinions were expressed at every Sunday dinner in the kind of patient, reasonable tone that makes a person feel invisible. Her grandson, Joseph, everyone called him Joe, was 14 that fall and sleeping in the loft of his father's barn because the farmhouse was crowded and nobody had asked him where he'd rather be. He was the kind of teenager who noticed things without saying them. He noticed that his grandmother ate less at those Sunday dinners each week, the way you notice a fire getting quieter before it goes out. He noticed that she still walked the 2 miles to the river and back 3 times a week, even though her hip had been bad since July. What Joe did not know, what nobody knew, was that Vera had been watching the Creekside Mill for 2 years. The Creekside Mill had been built in 1847 by a German immigrant named Heinrich Brauer. Stone construction, 2 stories, 34 feet wide and 40 feet long, sitting on a limestone foundation where Crane Creek fed into the Wapsipinicon floodplain. Brauer had installed an overshot wheel, 22 feet in diameter, 4 feet wide, fed by a mill pond. He dammed himself over the course of 3 summers. The pond was 7 acres when full. At peak operation in the 1860s and into the 1870s, the mill ground 80 to 100 bushels of grain per hour. Farmers came from 15 miles away. The Brauer family kept 1/16 of every bushel as toll, which was the custom, and Heinrich Brauer became a prosperous man. Then Minneapolis happened, and that is not a figure of speech. Minneapolis quite literally happened to every small grist mill in the upper Midwest. When Cadwallader Washburn rebuilt his flour mills along the Mississippi after the 1878 explosion with new Hungarian steel roller technology, the economics of stone-ground flour changed so fast that small mills didn't have time to adapt. By 1880, Minneapolis was producing 2 million barrels of flour a year. By 1890, it was 7 million. The big rail lines moved that flour everywhere cheaply. The smaller local mills, the ones grinding 80 bushels an hour on water power, couldn't sell their flour for what it cost them to produce it. Heinrich Brauer's son Karl tried to keep the mill running through the 1880s, cutting costs every year and losing customers to the cheaper railroad flour anyway. In the drought years of 1888 and 1889, when the Wapsipinicon ran low and the mill pond dropped 4 feet below the wheel's headrace intake, Karl Brauer gave up. He sold the iron fittings from the wheel mechanism to a salvage buyer in Waterloo for $14. He left the millstones, all 4 of them, 2 runner stones and 2 bedstones, because they weighed a combined 2,100 pounds and there was no good way to move them. He left the millrace, the 2 8-0-foot stone-lined channel that carried water from the pond to the wheel pit. He left the limestone walls, 2 feet thick at the base. He paid taxes on the property through 1,890, then stopped. By 1894, Buchanan County was owed 4 years of back taxes on the Creekside parcel. The county valued the property at $7 not because of some clerical error, but because that was genuinely what the parcel was worth at that moment. The mill structure had a partially collapsed north wall. The mill pond had silted in along its eastern edge. The wheel was gone except for its iron axle stubs. Nobody in the county wanted a building that leaked, a pond that was shrinking, and 4 pieces of granite that couldn't be moved without an ox team and 3 days of labour. Vera Lund wanted all of it. I want to stop here and be clear about something, because the story I'm telling you is not a story about luck. It is not a story about a plucky old woman and her grandson doing something charming with a broken building. The reason Vera understood what that mill was worth is because she understood something about stone that the people bidding at that county auction, all 0 of them, did not. Stone holds heat, and not the way wood holds heat, which is fast and brief and gone. Stone holds heat the way a debt holds its principal slowly, reliably, long after the original event that caused it is over. Here is the number that matters. Granite has a volumetric heat capacity of roughly 50 British thermal units per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit. Compare that to pine wood at about 18 British thermal units per cubic foot per degree. The millstones at Creekside weren't just heavy objects in a building. They were thermal batteries. Each 500-pound runner stone, warmed to 100 degrees Fahrenheit above room temperature by a sustained fire underneath it, held approximately 6,900 British thermal units of stored heat. Let that go slowly into a room and you have warmth for hours after the fire is dead. But that wasn't even the most important physics in that building. The millrace, the stone-lined channel cut into the earth and running 280 feet from the pond to the wheel pit, sat at a depth of 4 feet below grade for most of its length, deepening to 6 feet where it entered the mill foundation. At 4 feet below the Iowa frost line, the earth maintains a temperature between 44 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, not warm by any standard, but not freezing. At 6 feet, where the millrace channel passed under the mill floor, the earth temperature was stable enough that even in January, even in the worst winters Buchanan County had ever seen, water in that channel didn't freeze solid. What Vera had been thinking about, walking down to the river 3 times a week for 2 years, was whether the millrace could serve as cold storage the way a deep cellar serves. Below the frost line, food doesn't freeze, it doesn't rot as fast, A stone-lined channel at constant 4-6-degree temperature was, in practical terms, a 280-foot refrigerator. And unlike a dug cellar, it already existed. Carl Brower had already done the hardest work. She sent Joe to the auction in October 1894 with $7 silver, which was her entire savings from the egg money she'd been collecting since Pedder died. She told him to sit quietly, wait for the county alderman to call the Creekside parcel, and bid exactly $7, not 6, not 7.5, 7. She had done the math. 4 years of back taxes at the county's assessed rate on a $7 valuation came to exactly that. Joe came home with a deed in his coat pocket. He told his grandmother what Alderman Orrin Pask had said when Joe raised his hand and offered the bid. Pask had looked at him, a 14-year-old boy in a coat 2 sizes too big, and then looked around the room at the men of Buchanan County and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Sold to the Lund boy. His grandmother must be teaching him to throw money away." The men laughed. Vera heard this and said nothing for a long moment. Then she told Joe to eat his supper while it was hot. They started work at the mill the first week of November, 1894. Joe would remember later that the walk from the Lund farm to the mill was 2.3 miles, and that he made it 47 times before the first snow, always with Vera beside him, and always carrying something: tools, timber scraps, bags of mortar sand. His grandmother was 71 years old, and she outwalked him every time, not faster but steadier, moving at exactly the pace she intended to move at without deviating from it, which was a different thing entirely from being fast. The north wall was the first order of business. 2 courses of limestone had shifted and cracked, where frost had worked into a mortar joint over several winters without maintenance. Vera mixed a lime-sand mortar using limestone. She burned herself in the yard. You heat limestone to about 1,650 degrees Fahrenheit in a contained fire, what's called a lime burn, and the calcium carbonate releases carbon dioxide and becomes calcium oxide, which you then slake with water to make the putty mortar that's been holding stone buildings together since the Romans. Joe carried the stones, Vera set them. He asked her once where she had learned to do that. She said her father had built 2 stone barns in Telemark before they emigrated, and she had watched him do it every summer from the time she was 6. She didn't say it like something she was proud of. She said it like a fact about the weather. The north wall took 9 days. 6 courses of limestone reset, joints packed and smoothed, the wall plumb within a 1/4 inch. When it was done, the building was weathertight on all 4 sides for the first time since Carl Brower walked away. Joe also learned something during those 9 days that nobody had taught him in school or in his father's barn, which is this: mortar work in November requires you to think about temperature the whole time. Hot lime mortar needs time to cure, and curing stops below freezing. If you set a course on a cold afternoon and the temperature drops hard overnight, you come back in the morning to loose stones. So Vera made them pack damp burlap sacks against every fresh course before they left each evening, which held enough warmth from the day to keep the mortar from cracking. Joe asked why they didn't just work faster to beat the cold. Vera said that working faster was how you got it done twice. That was most of what she taught him that fall, not in lectures but in small corrections. Think about what happens after you leave. Think about what the material is going to do when you're not watching it. A wall is still a wall in February. A mortar joint that failed in November is just a crack you have to fix again. Then they turned to the mill race. The channel had been silted in over 5 years of neglect. Sediment from the pond, silt, clay, some rotted organic material had filled the upper 40 feet of the race to within a foot of the stone cap. They dug it out by hand, Joe with a spade and Vera with a smaller tool, both of them working from the pond end backward toward the mill. The stone lining of the race was intact everywhere they cleared. Brower had built it right, with limestone blocks fitted without mortar, relying on friction and their own weight to stay in place. When the channel was clear, Vera walked its length and checked the depth at 3 points with a measuring rod. 5 feet 2 inches at the pond end, 5 feet 8 inches at the midpoint, 6 feet 1 inch where it passed, under the mill floor. She nodded at each measurement, the way you nod when something is exactly as you expected it to be. She explained what she was doing to Joe while they worked, not as a lesson but as conversation. Water that deep doesn't freeze because the earth around it is warmer than the air. The ground at that depth in Iowa holds around 46 to 50 degrees year-round, warmer than freezing, so water moving through that channel stays liquid even slowly, and anything stored in the channel stays at 46 to 50 degrees. Butter doesn't go rancid at 46 degrees. Salt pork keeps for months at 46 degrees. Root vegetables last through March at 46 degrees. The reason this works is that the heat in the ground doesn't come from the air, it comes from below. The Earth's core is still hot, has been hot since the planet formed, and that heat conducts slowly upward through the rock and soil. At about 5 to 6 feet down in Iowa, the upward heat from the Earth's interior and the downward cold from winter air reach a kind of standoff. The temperature sits near 48 degrees and barely moves regardless of what's happening at the surface. You could have 3 feet of snow above and minus 20 degrees at the surface, and 6 feet down it's still 48 degrees. Heinrich Brauer had cut a channel into that zone without quite understanding the physics of it. He just needed the water to flow and not freeze. The physics solved his problem anyway. What Vera saw was that the same physics could solve a different problem, not water delivery but food preservation. The channel wasn't a convenience anymore. It was the deepest cold storage within 5 miles. They fitted the cleared millrace with wooden storage shelves sunk into niches carved into the limestone sidewalls, suspended above the thin stream of water that still seeped through from the pond, even in dry conditions. By the 3rd week of November, 140 pounds of salt pork wrapped in muslin, 60 pounds of hard cheese sealed in wax, and 6 bushels of turnips and parsnips were sitting in that channel at a constant 47 degrees Fahrenheit. The part that took Joe longer to understand, the part he said he didn't really grasp until he saw it working in January, was what Vera intended to do with the mill pond. The pond was 7 acres at full size and had been sitting at reduced capacity since the 1889 drought. Even shrunken to 5.5 acres, it still held an enormous volume of water, and water, plain water, has one of the highest heat capacities of any common substance on Earth. 1 gallon of water holds 5 times more heat than the same volume of granite. A pond of 5.5 acres, even at 10 feet average depth, contains roughly 18 million gallons. At the pond's late fall temperature of 38 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that water mass represented a thermal buffer so large it was almost impossible to think about in human terms. What this meant practically was that even as November air temperatures dropped to 15 degrees, 10 degrees, 5 degrees, the pond surface froze slowly, not because of any trick Vera performed, but simply because there was so much heat stored in that water mass that it took weeks of sustained cold to pull it out. The pond surface didn't develop solid ice until mid-December most years, and below the ice, the water stayed liquid all the way to the bottom because water is densest at 39 degrees Fahrenheit and sinks, keeping the depths above freezing even when the surface is frozen solid. Joe measured this one morning in late November with a thermometer borrowed from the Quasqueton pharmacy. Air temperature was -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Water temperature at pond surface, where a thin skim of ice was forming, 32 degrees. Water temperature 2 feet below the surface, 36 degrees. He didn't have a thermometer long enough to reach the bottom, but Vera told him it was warmer down there than it was near the top, which seemed wrong until he thought about it. The mill sat 40 feet from the pond edge. The thermal mass of that water body, millions of gallons at above freezing temperature, releasing heat slowly all winter, moderated the air temperature around the building, not dramatically but measurably. On January nights, when the open fields around Independence registered -12 degrees, the air at the mill measured -6 degrees. 6 degrees sounds like nothing until you're talking about how much wood you need to burn to keep a space at 50 degrees. The difference between -12 outside and -6 outside is roughly 30% less fuel consumption. The difference between 3/4 of a cord a week and half a cord. The pond also gave them watercress. This sounds like a small thing, but in January it was not a small thing. Watercress grows in moving water where springs keep the temperature above freezing year-round, and the seep that fed the mill pond through the winter came out of the hillside at 56 degrees. Spring water always does, because it comes from below the frost line. The cress grew thick at that seep. Vitamin C, mostly, but also iron and calcium. You can survive a hard winter on stored grain and salt pork alone, but you get sick from it. Fresh greens in January in Iowa were not something most county families had access to. Vera and Joe had them. And the pond gave them ice, which is where the county's understanding of the mill's value went wrong in a way that would matter enormously by February. The men of Buchanan County thought about ice the way most people in 1894 thought about it, as something that happened to water when it got cold enough. But Vera thought about ice as a product, a storable and transferable commodity with a market price of 25 to 35 cents per 100 pounds in the river towns of northeast Iowa. By 1886, the natural ice industry in the United States was harvesting 25 million tons per year. Even in a small market like Buchanan County, a 7-acre mill pond that froze to 14 inches of solid clear ice, the minimum thickness for safe harvesting and the minimum the commercial buyers would grade at full price, could yield several thousand tons in a good freeze year. An acre of 1-2-inch ice yields roughly 1,000 tons. At 30 cents per 100 pounds, a ton of ice is $6. At even a conservative 500 tons harvested from the creekside pond, that was $3,000 worth of product, more than 400 times what Vera had paid for the whole property. She and Joe cut ice in January of 1895. They scored the surface with a hand saw in 2 2x3 2-inch blocks. Joe pulled them out with iron tongs. Vera stacked them in the old grain storage loft of the mill, packed in sawdust she'd collected in November from the Quasqueton lumber yard for free because the yard considered sawdust a nuisance. Sawdust has a thermal conductivity of about 0.08 watts per meter Kelvin, roughly the same insulating value as loose straw and better than air alone. Packed around ice blocks 3 feet deep, it extended the melt time from weeks to months. The ice trade in Waterloo needed summer deliveries. If you could hold your ice through April, you had something worth hauling to a city market. This was all still ahead of them, but before any of it, before the county came to the Creekside Mill in any capacity, they had to get through the January that nobody saw coming. Vera and Joe were not quiet about what they were doing. They couldn't afford to be. The repairs to the north wall required lime, which they bought in Quasqueton. The work on the millrace required a second iron spade, which they bought in Independence. People saw a 7-1-year-old woman and a 1-4-year-old boy walking 2.3 miles to an abandoned mill 3 days a week and coming back with mud on their boots, and people drew the conclusions that seemed reasonable. The first person to say something directly was Elmer Schaefer, who farmed the section adjacent to the Creekside parcel on the north. Schaefer was a practical man, not a cruel one, and he stopped Vera on the road in late November and told her, in the considered tone of a man trying to save someone embarrassment, "Mrs. Lund, that building isn't worth fixing. The wheel's gone, the millrace fills with silt every spring. You've got $7 buried in it, and you'll spend 70 more and have nothing to show for it." Vera told him she appreciated his concern and kept walking. "I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think people reading it from today tend to underestimate how much those words cost her. Schaefer wasn't wrong about the wheel. He wasn't wrong about the silt. In purely conventional terms, in terms of what a functioning mill required and what the Brower mill was missing, he was making a sensible engineering assessment. The wheel was gone. You cannot grind grain without power. That was what the mill had been, and it had stopped being that. And in Schaefer's understanding, there was nothing else for a mill to be. What Schaefer couldn't see, and what Pask couldn't see, and what the men at the feed store in Quasqueton couldn't see, was that Vera wasn't trying to restore a mill. She wasn't trying to get back to what the building had been. She was trying to get to what the building could do with what was still there. And those are genuinely different goals that require different thinking, and the county was only equipped for one of them. By December, the conversations in Quasqueton were less gentle. Alderman Pask repeated his auction remark at the feed store and embellished it. Now it was the Lund woman playing house in a ruin and teaching the boy to waste his winters. A farmer named Connolly, who had sold grain to the Brower mill before Carl shut it down, said he'd walked by in the second week of November and seen the old woman setting mortar in the north wall, and that it was the saddest thing he'd seen in 20 years. He meant that charitably. It didn't feel charitable. Joe's father Eric sent 3 Sunday dinner messages through his wife, Joe's mother Ingrid, each one a variation on the same concern, that Vera was embarrassing the family, that people were talking, that it wasn't too late to walk away from the investment and take the tax certificate as a loss. Joe sat at those dinners and ate his food and said he would think about it, which was what his mother had taught him to say when there was nothing useful to say. Joe did not think about it. He thought about the millrace depth at 5 feet 8 inches at midpoint and what 46 degrees felt like on the back of his hand when he reached down into the channel. He thought about the runner stone he'd touched on the 3rd day, still warm at 4 in the afternoon from the fire they'd set under the bedstone at 9 in the morning. 7 hours of retained heat from 4 hours of burning. He thought about what that meant in wood consumption terms over a winter. He was 14 years old, and he was doing math that none of the men at the Quasqueton feed store were doing, because none of them were sleeping 4 nights a week in the building. Nobody came to help. Nobody offered tools or labor. Nobody sent a message through the church network the way the church network in Iowa farming communities usually functioned when someone was visibly struggling. The consensus was that Vera was doing something between foolish and pathetic, and the kindest response was to let her finish and then be there to say they'd told her so. There was one exception. A widow named Clara Hoft, who lived near the Crane Creek crossing, appeared one Saturday morning in late November with a basket containing 2 pounds of dried beans, a pound of lard, and a note that said, in a hand that suggested she didn't write often, "I don't know what you're doing, but I think you know what you're doing." Vera kept the note. Joe found it in her effects when she died in 1906, folded into her Bible at the Book of Ruth. Joe heard all the rest of it, the Pask remarks, the Connolly condescension, his father's quiet pressure, and said nothing, because Vera had told him not to answer it. She said the only answer worth giving was a building that worked, and that was still 6 weeks away. The mill structure, limestone walls, slate floor, the 2 remaining millstones on their wooden bed frames, was already a better shelter than most of Buchanan County understood. The walls were 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the roof line. Limestone has a thermal mass roughly equal to granite, 45 British thermal units per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit. 2 feet of solid limestone does not insulate well by modern standards. Its R value is only about R6, compared to a well-built modern wall at R20 or better. But thermal mass is not the same as insulation. The mass of those walls absorbed heat slowly during the day and released it slowly at night. There was no spike of cold at dawn. no desperate middle-of-the-night stoking. The temperature inside the mill varied by perhaps 8 to 10 degrees over a full winter day and night cycle, compared to 20 to 30 degrees in a standard timber frame farmhouse. This distinction matters enough to linger on. Most frontier heating was what you might call reactive. You felt the cold, you put more wood in the stove blazed, the room got warm, the stove died down, the room got cold again. The cycle repeated every few hours. You were always chasing the temperature from behind. A standard iron box stove, running flat out on seasoned hardwood, can produce 40,000 to 60,000 British thermal units per hour. But that heat goes straight up and out. The air warms, you feel warm, but when the fire banks, the air cools in minutes. The walls never got warm enough to contribute anything back. In the Brower mill, the situation was different. The walls had been absorbing and releasing heat for 47 years. They had a thermal inertia, a resistance to temperature change that no frame building could match. When Vera built her firebox between the millstones and ran it for 4 hours each morning, she wasn't just heating air. She was charging the walls and the stones the way you charge a battery. The release was slow and steady. At 9 o'clock in the evening, when the fire had been banked since noon, the wall temperature on the interior face was still 58 degrees Fahrenheit, not warm by comfort standards, but 58 degrees in Iowa in January is the difference between pipes that freeze and pipes that don't. The two runner stones, the rotating upper stones, each weighed approximately 520 pounds of French bourre, which is a particularly dense freshwater quartz. Quartz has a heat capacity slightly above granite, about 820 joules per kilogram per degree Kelvin. Each runner stone, warmed through a full day of steady wood fire to 150 degrees Fahrenheit above room temperature, held approximately 9,200 British thermal units of stored thermal energy. Both stones together, 18,400 British thermal units. That is roughly equivalent to burning 3 pounds of dry hardwood, released not in a burst but over 6 to 8 hours as the stones cooled. The bedstones, the fixed lower stones, were made of a local sandstone Carl Brower had sourced from a Buchanan County quarry. Sandstone has a lower specific heat than French bourre, around 710 joules per kilogram per degree Kelvin, and both bedstones together weighed about 1,060 pounds. Still significant thermal mass that kept charging and releasing. All 4 stones combined represented more than 2,100 pounds of material that, once warmed, would not give up that warmth quickly. To put a human scale on it, 4 stones totaling 2,100 pounds, heated to 150 degrees above ambient and discharging over 8 hours, would produce roughly 32,000 British thermal units in sustained heat. A standard frame farmhouse in January needs 40,000 to 60,000 British thermal units per hour to maintain a comfortable temperature. But the Brower mill, with its 2-foot limestone walls, its stone floor, its reduced air volume from interior partitions Vera built using salvaged lumber, needed only about 18,000 British thermal units per hour to hold at 50 degrees on a -10 degree day. The stones alone, charged once in the morning, covered most of that load until mid-afternoon. Vera built a firebox between the 2 bedstones, using flat limestone pieces she pulled from the collapsed section of the north wall, a low arch, 18 inches high, open on one side, with the 2 bedstones flanking it and the runner stones resting on their spindles above. She fired it in the morning with whatever wood she and Joe had split the day before, ran it hard for 4 hours, then banked it. The stones held the heat through the afternoon and into the evening. A small cast-iron stove near the door handled the gaps. The total wood consumption to keep the interior of the Creekside mill at 50 degrees Fahrenheit through a December night with outside temperatures at 0 was about 1/3 of a cord per week. A comparable volume in a frame house she knew from 30 years of managing the family farm was closer to a full cord. The stones did what the stones had always done. They absorbed heat when there was too much of it, and gave it back when there wasn't enough. By the second week of December, Vera and Joe were sleeping at the mill 4 nights a week. Joe's father Eric did not speak to his mother for 3 days when he found out. On the 4th day, he sent over 2 extra wool blankets through Ingrid, without explanation, which was Eric Lund's way of acknowledging that he might be wrong about something without having to say so out loud. The 7th of January, 1895. The temperature at the Waterloo weather station that morning was minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit, with a northwest wind at 22 miles per hour, giving a wind chill equivalent to minus 38 degrees. What was coming, what had been building in Alberta and driving south through Minnesota for 5 days, was what old-timers in that part of Iowa would later call the deep earth freeze of 1895. Not because it had any official meteorological name, but because of what it did to the ground. The frost line in Buchanan County, Iowa, typically penetrates to about 40 to 48 inches in a normal winter. In January and February of 1895, sustained temperatures between minus 15 and minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit drove that frost line to 62 inches, 5 feet 2 inches of frozen earth. Standard root cellars in that county were dug to 36 to 42 inches, which was sufficient for ordinary winters. In the deep earth freeze, the frost reached into those cellars. The first reports came in on January 14th, a week into the sustained cold. Root vegetables frozen solid in cellars that had never frozen before in living memory. Butter in underground crocks turned to something between soft ice and sawdust. A family named Kellogg, 3 miles north of Independence, lost 400 pounds of salt pork to freezing in a cellar they'd used without problem for 11 years. Grain stored in standard wood-sided granaries froze in ways grain normally doesn't, not the kernels themselves, which can survive quite low temperatures, but the surface moisture on the kernels, which expanded and caused the outer hull of the wheat to split. Damaged grain doesn't grind into good flour. It grinds into something that bakes poorly and keeps worse. The county discovered it had a problem that went beyond the immediate winter. Every family in Buchanan County that depended on stored grain for the rest of the winter and spring planting was now rationing. Nobody had a mill to bring their grain to the nearest operating commercial mill. Was in Waterloo, 18 miles away, on roads that in January 1895 were drifted and impassable much of the time. The county's own grain reserves, kept in the Independence courthouse basement, had been stored at a depth of only 3 feet below grade. The frost reached them on January 19th. Alderman Orrin Pask sent a rider to every farm in the county and took stock. The picture he got back was not a catastrophe, but it was leaning that direction. 3 families were already short on flour. 8 more were using what they'd intended to save for seed. The county had no mechanism to grind the grain it had because the nearest functioning mill was in Waterloo and the roads weren't opening soon. And then someone told him about the Brower Mill. The millstones at Creekside were not connected to a working wheel. The overshot wheel was gone. Vera had not rebuilt it that would have taken a full crew, a millwright, and money she did not have. What she had done was clear the millrace, restore the stone-lined channel, and patch the north wall. The mill was weather-tight and heated. It was not, in any conventional sense, operational. But a millstone doesn't need a water wheel to turn. You can drive a runner stone with a horse. That's how many small mills operated before water power became standard, and many continued to do so as backup. A horse-powered capstan, a simple wooden arm attached to the runner-stone spindle, the horse walking in a circle will turn a millstone at perhaps 1/5 of the speed of a water-powered mill, but it turns. Vera had known this. She had not told anyone, because nobody had asked her. and also because she had not had an ox or a horse available at the mill until Joe persuaded his father to loan them the draft horse called Brun for what Eric was told would be 1 week. When Orrin Pask rode out to the Creekside Mill on January 21st, 1895, with his hat pulled low and his scarf wrapped over his face against the -14 degrees outside, he found a 7-1-year-old woman and her 4-year-old grandson in a building that was 51 degrees Fahrenheit. On the interior he checked against his pocket thermometer, which he did not believe the first time, so he checked again with a large grey horse walking slow circles in the attached lean-to, turning a stone arm attached to the runner stone of a millstone that was, in fact, grinding grain. Pask stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he said the only sensible thing a man in his position could say, "Mrs. Lund, what will you charge by the bushel?" Vera had figured this out 2 weeks earlier. She said, "The county can have the first 50 bushels for what the mill's back taxes cost. After that, 1/16th toll, same as Brower." Pask took off his hat. From January 22nd through March 3rd, 1895, every farm family in Buchanan County that needed grain ground brought it to the Creekside Mill. The process was slow. Horse-powered grinding produces about 15 to 20 bushels per hour, compared to a water wheel's 80 to 100, but it was grain ground into flour, and flour that people could bake with, and that was what the county needed. Joe kept the fire going under the millstones. Vera took the toll and kept the record in a ledger she'd bought in Quasqueton in November. Brun the horse walked his circles. 4 families camped at the mill for a night or two while their grain was being worked through, because 18 miles of bad road wasn't something you did twice in a day in January. Vera fed them out of the millrace, where the salt pork and root vegetables she and Joe had stored in the stone-lined channel were sitting at 47 degrees Fahrenheit, untouched by the frost that had ruined the Kellogg's cellar, and everyone else who'd stored food at ordinary depths. Elmer Schaefer came in the first week of February with 6 bushels of wheat. He stood and watched the millstone turn for a while without saying anything. Then he asked Vera how much it was going to cost him. She told him. He paid and left. Joe told me, "I'm telling you what he wrote in a letter he composed in 1941 when he was 61 years old, that Alderman Pask never directly acknowledged to Vera that he had been wrong about the mill. He thanked her in the formal public way of county officials who need to preserve something. He paid the toll. He arranged for the county to contribute timber for a rebuilt millrace cap in the spring. He helped facilitate the purchase of a pair of work oxen to replace the horse-powered grinding system, which made the mill faster and reduced the dependency on borrowed animals. But he never said, 'I was wrong. You were right. What you built was more valuable than I understood.' What happened instead was that the county needed the mill. So the county used the mill, and slowly, by the logic of necessity, Vera Lund went from being the woman who threw $7 into a ruin to being the woman who ran the only functioning mill in Buchanan County through the worst winter in a decade. Joe wrote that his grandmother didn't need Pask to say it. She knew what she had. She had known since October, when the crows left early. The millstones at Creekside survived because they were too heavy to steal. Carl Brower left them not out of generosity, but because 2,100 pounds of stone is 2,100 pounds of stone, and there was no good reason to move them. The millrace survived because stone-lined channels, built right, are essentially permanent unless someone actively destroys them. The pond survived because nobody needed to destroy it. And the limestone walls survived because limestone walls 2 feet thick are simply very hard to damage by accident. Everything that made the Creekside Mill valuable in January 1895 was also what made it look worthless in October 1894. The wheel was gone. That was the visible mechanism, the part people understood and could evaluate. Everything else was invisible. The thermal mass of the stones, the stable temperature of the deep race, the buffering effect of the mill pond on the surrounding air, the structural integrity of 2-foot limestone walls that had been standing since 1847. Orrin Pask looked at the mill and saw a broken machine. Vera Lund looked at it and saw a physics problem she already knew how to solve. The difference between those two ways of seeing is not wisdom, exactly. It is more specific than that. It is the difference between knowing what a thing can do and only knowing what it's been doing. The mill had been grinding grain. When it stopped grinding grain, it seemed useless. Vera knew it had also been, for 47 years, slowly demonstrating the thermal properties of granite and the temperature stability of deep stone channels. It just hadn't needed to demonstrate them for anything other than flour before. Joe worked at the Creekside Mill until 1911, when he married a woman named Agnes Sorby from Winthrop and moved his family to the mill property, which Vera had signed over to him in 1903 at the age of 80. By that point, a new water wheel had been installed, a breast wheel this time, 18 feet in diameter, and the mill was grinding grain commercially again, supplemented in the off-season by ice sails from the mill pond, which had expanded back to its original 7 acres after Joe dredged the silted eastern edge in the spring of 1896. Vera Lund died in September 1906 at the age of 83. The obituary in the Independence newspaper described her as a long-time resident of the county and the matriarch of the Lund family. It did not mention the mill. Joe kept the millstones. He told his own children and his grandchildren, when they got old enough to understand what he was telling them, that those stones had saved the county, not the wheel, not the race, not the pond. The stones. Because the stones were what convinced people to come in out of the cold in January 1895 and accept that a 7-1-year-old woman and a 1-4-year-old boy had figured out something the county had walked past for 5 years. The reason those stones could do that is real, and it's not complicated. Dense material absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. A 500-pound stone warmed over 4 hours holds that heat for 8. The math doesn't care who did the warming. It doesn't care about the age of the woman who built the firebox or the size of the boy who carried the wood. Physics is indifferent in a way that turns out to be very fair. The mill pond at the old Brower site in Buchanan County is still there. There's nothing left of the mill building. The limestone was quarried out for other construction projects in the 1950s, which is an Iowa story, if there ever was one. But the pond is still there, and the millrace cut is still visible as a depression in the earth if you know what you're looking for. At 6 feet below grade, the temperature along that old channel right now, whatever month you're watching this, whatever the weather is outside, is somewhere between 46 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The earth hasn't changed. The physics hasn't changed. The depth that was cold storage for Vera Lund's salt pork in January 1895 is still cold storage for anything someone wanted to put there today. The Brower mill didn't become worthless when the wheel broke. It became invisible. Those are different things, and the difference matters. Vera Lund saw it from 2 miles away, 3 times a week, for 2 years before she had the $7 to do anything about it.